The night Victoria Bradford handed her credit card to a stranger, she never imagined it would change her life. The charity gala at Boston's Harborfront Hotel glittered with the kind of wealth that forgot itself, women in Valentino gowns
Let's
discussing
settle
ski
this,
chalets in
shall
Aspen.
we?
Men comparing yacht specifications over bourbon that cost more per glass than some families spent on groceries in a month. Victoria moved through the crowd, wearing diamonds that had belonged to her grandmother, a $2 million necklace she'd selected that evening with the same casual attention most people gave to choosing socks. The Children's Heart Foundation event required a $100 minimum donation at the door, pocket change for the assembled guests who routinely wrote five-figure checks without consulting their accountants. Victoria had arrived with Natalie Calloway and Blake Morrison, her closest friends, from a social circle where proximity meant shared tax brackets rather than shared values. They donated $5,000 between them before the cocktail hour ended the transaction as unconscious as breathing. Marcus Hayes approached the registration table at 8:47. His presence a disruption in the careful choreography of privilege. The borrowed suit hung slightly wrong across his shoulders. The fabric stretched where his frame carried more muscle than the original owner's. His hands told a different story than the formal wear suggested: calloused palms, fingers with small scars, the unmistakable marks of someone who worked with tools rather than spreadsheets. He spoke quietly to the volunteer manning the table, a college student whose smile faltered as she consulted her tablet and shook her head. Victoria watched from 20 feet away, champagne flute balanced between manicured fingers. Natalie noticed her attention and followed her gaze. "Look at that guy trying to crash the gala." Blake smirked, already reaching for his phone to capture what he assumed would be an entertaining confrontation. The volunteer's voice carried across the marble floor, apologetic but firm, explaining the minimum donation requirement. Marcus stood frozen, his face carefully blank. In that particular way people adopt when embarrassment threatens to crack through their composure. He nodded once and began to turn away. Victoria moved before conscious thought caught up with impulse. She glided to the registration table, her heels clicking against marble, and produced her platinum American Express card with a flourish that ensured her friends could see the gesture. 24 hours, spend whatever you want. Think of it as a social experiment. Natalie's laughter rang out bright and sharp. Someone behind them made a comment about Pretty Woman in reverse, and the small cluster of observers chuckled at the reference. Victoria felt the warm glow of being clever, generous, the center of attention in a room full of people who competed daily for relevance. She extended the card toward Marcus, who looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read: assessment. Recognition of something she didn't understand. Then a careful emptiness that settled over his features like a mask. He took the card without speaking, without gratitude, without even meeting her eyes directly. One nod, economical and final, and then he walked toward the exit. The October air rushed in when the doors opened, cold enough to make Victoria shiver despite her cashmere wrap. Marcus disappeared into the night, and Victoria returned to her friends with a story already forming about what she'd done. How she'd proven something about generosity and human nature and the vast distance between her world and his. 3 hours later, while Victoria slept in her $15,000 a month apartment overlooking the Charles River, Marcus Hayes sat at a kitchen table 23 miles east and processed a payment that would have been incomprehensible to her in its necessity. Boston Children's Hospital's online portal accepted the transaction at 2:43 in the morning, $47,322. Payment in full. The apartment building in Dorchester had been modest middle-class housing in 1968 when it was built. By the time Marcus moved in 5 years ago, it had declined into the kind of neglected rental property where elevators stayed broken for months and fluorescent lights flickered in hallways that smelled of old cooking grease and accumulated disappointments. He climbed to the third floor, quietly careful not to wake Mrs. Patricia Sullivan next door. She worked night shifts as an emergency room nurse at Mass General, her schedule a brutal rotation that required sleep during daylight hours. Marcus had learned to move through the building like a ghost, minimizing his impact on other people's fragile rest. Inside his apartment, the living room doubled as his bedroom. A mattress on the floor near the window, blankets folded with military precision each morning. The kitchen was barely large enough for one person to stand comfortably, with a refrigerator that ran loud and a stove where only 3 burners worked. The bathroom had unreliable hot water, a problem the landlord kept promising to fix and never did. But the second bedroom, the only real bedroom, belonged to Rosalie, and Marcus had made sure it was as comfortable as his limited resources allowed. He pushed open her door carefully, letting the hall light spill across drawings taped to the walls. Rosie, at 8 years old, was small for her age, her body carrying the particular fragility of a child who'd learned early that physical exertion had consequences. She slept with the stillness of someone who'd been taught not to toss and turn, not to spike her heart rate even in dreams. Her red hair spread across the pillow, copper curls inherited from her mother. Freckles scattered across her nose and cheeks, a constellation Marcus sometimes counted, when worry kept him awake, and watching her breathe became the only meditation that worked. The nightlight cast shadows that made the room feel larger than its actual dimensions. Rosie had drawn pictures of elephants and hearts of herself holding her father's hand, of a woman with red hair who existed now only in photographs and memories. Kate had died 5 years ago on an operating table, her heart giving out during a surgery that was supposed to fix the same ventricular septal defect their daughter had inherited. The genetic lottery had dealt them matching defects, mother and daughter connected by the same flaw in the walls between their ventricles. Kate had survived 31 years before the defect became critical. Rosie was 8, and already she'd outlived the timeline doctors had once predicted. Marcus stood in the doorway, counting his daughter's breaths, the habit so ingrained he could do it without conscious thought. 17 breaths per minute, steady and even. Her oxygen saturation was probably good. No signs of the arrhythmia that sometimes made her dizzy. He pulled the door nearly closed and returned to the kitchen, where evidence of their financial reality spread across the cheap laminate table like an accusation. Boston Children's Hospital billing statements formed the largest pile. $47,322 for cardiac catheterization procedures. Ventricular septal defect. Monitoring specialist consultations, medications that cost more than groceries. The bills had arrived in waves over the past 3 years, each one adding weight to a debt Marcus had no way to carry. Collection agencies called at dinner time with voices trained to sound simultaneously sympathetic and threatening. They offered payment plans he couldn't afford, reduced settlements that still required thousands he didn't have, consequences that ranged from damaged credit to legal action. Next to the medical bills sat an eviction notice. 3 months of back rent plus late fees totaled $4,850. The property management company had filed paperwork. Marcus had 7 days to vacate or face forcible removal. 7 days to find a new apartment that would accept someone with ruined credit, no savings, and a child with expensive medical needs. 7 days to figure out how to keep Rosie stable during the stress of moving. How to ensure her medications didn't run out during the transition. How to maintain any semblance of the routine she needed to stay healthy. The electric company had sent a final notice. $580 past due, with a disconnection date scheduled for the following week. Marcus had called them twice, explaining his situation, asking for more time, offering to pay partial amounts. The customer service representatives followed their scripts with the mechanical sympathy of people who heard desperate stories all day and had no authority to deviate from policy. Pay the full amount or lose electricity. Those were the options. Credit card statements showed maxed balances from the year Kate died, when Marcus had charged groceries and rent and funeral expenses because his paycheck as a construction foreman hadn't stretched far enough to cover the catastrophic expenses of losing a spouse while raising a medically fragile 3-year-old alone. He'd made minimum payments for 2 years before defaulting entirely. The interest had compounded into numbers that felt like fiction debts that would outlive him if he never addressed them. Prescription medication costs appeared on a pharmacy statement. $240 monthly for Rosie's cardiac medications. Digoxin to control her heart rate and Alapril to reduce the strain on her ventricles, aspirin to prevent clots. Missing even a few doses could trigger the arrhythmia that sent her heart racing too fast or too slow, that made her dizzy and pale, that required emergency room visits and all the cascading costs that followed. Marcus picked up Victoria's platinum card, turning it over in his hands. The weight of it suggested quality, the kind of object designed for people who never checked balances or worried about declined transactions. She'd expected him to waste it to confirm every assumption she held about poor people and self-control. She'd wanted proof that poverty stemmed from character defects rather than circumstances. She'd turned his desperation into entertainment for her friends, a story she'd tell at future parties about the man who couldn't resist the temptation of unlimited spending. He could buy Rosie the stuffed purple elephant she'd admired in the bodega window last week. $12. A luxury and indulgence, something beyond survival. She'd been so careful not to ask for it directly, just commenting on how soft it looked, how purple was her favorite color. Marcus had felt the familiar weight of inadequacy settle heavier on his chest, the knowledge that he couldn't provide his daughter with even the smallest joys without calculating whether that $12 meant choosing between electricity and medicine later. But this wasn't his money. It wasn't money at all, not in any meaningful sense. It was a test, a trap, a rich woman's cruel joke wrapped in the appearance of generosity. Using it for Rosie's medical bills felt justified because medical debt was systemic cruelty. Because no child should be denied care due to cost, because the bills represented genuine needs rather than wants. The rent and utilities fell into the same category. Survival, not luxury. The minimum required to keep his daughter alive and housed and safe. Marcus opened his laptop, a 6-year-old machine that took several minutes to boot up. He navigated to Boston Children's Hospital billing portal and logged into the account he'd been avoiding for months. The balance appeared in red numbers that might as well have been a prison sentence. $47,322. He entered Victoria's credit card information with hands that wanted to shake but didn't. His finger hovered over the submit button. The decision crystallized with sudden clarity. She wanted to prove something about people like him. He wanted to prove something too. That money wasn't the measure of a person's worth. That how someone spent mattered more than how much they had. That being poor didn't mean being foolish or greedy or less than human. That he could be handed unlimited resources and still choose only what he genuinely needed. He clicked submit and watched the screen process the transaction. Confirmation appeared, payment accepted, account balance 0. Marcus stared at the words until they stopped feeling real, until the magnitude of what he'd just done settled into his bones. Rosie wouldn't face medical collections now. The hospital would provide her care without the shadow of unpaid debt complicating every appointment. One catastrophic weight lifted, even if temporary, even if he still owed Victoria eventually. He paid the back rent next, $4,850 to the property management company's online portal. Then the electric company. $580 to keep the lights on the refrigerator running, the space heater functioning during winter nights. The pharmacy's prescription copays, $127 to ensure Rosie's medications didn't run out. Finally, a grocery store payment card, $180 for eggs, bread, milk, chicken, vegetables. Food for the week, maybe 2 if he stretched it carefully. Marcus fell asleep at the kitchen table sometime after 4 in the morning, his head resting on his folded arms. When Rosie found him at 7, she touched his shoulder with the gentle concern of a child who'd learned to monitor her father's well-being as carefully as he monitored hers. "Daddy, you forgot to sleep in your bed." He lifted his head, neck stiff, the kitchen light harsh after hours of darkness. "I know, sweetheart. I was doing some work." She climbed onto his lap carefully, never exerting herself too much. The doctors had explained that her heart condition required constant monitoring, that stress could trigger complications, that she needed to avoid activities that spiked her heart rate. At 8 years old, she moved through the world like a cautious ghost, always aware of her own fragility. "Is it about the hospital letters?" Marcus hesitated. He'd tried to shield her from the financial reality, but children noticed more than adults gave them credit for. She'd overheard phone calls with collection agencies, seen him sort through bills with the expression of someone drowning in increments. Not anymore. He meant it. Whatever consequences came from using Victoria's card, Rosie's medical debt was resolved. He made breakfast with what remained in the refrigerator: eggs, scrambled with the last of the butter toast from a loaf nearing its expiration date. While she ate, he looked at the credit card still sitting on the table. 24 hours. Victoria had given him 24 hours, probably expecting him to spend it all in the first few hours on frivolous purchases she could point to later. Instead, he'd used exactly what he needed and nothing more. The discipline of poverty had taught him to see money as a tool for survival rather than pleasure. Every dollar carried weight, every purchase had consequences. He wouldn't waste this opportunity on things he didn't need. Pride was a luxury too, and he didn't have room for it. Victoria Bradford woke at 7:15 with a champagne headache and the vague memory of having done something clever the night before. Her bedroom overlooked the Charles River, floor-to-ceiling windows framing a view that cost more monthly than most families earned in a year. She reached for her phone out of habit, scanning notifications, with the expectation of social media updates and calendar reminders. The American Express fraud alert appeared among the usual noise, and she almost dismissed it before something made her tap the notification. Boston Children's Hospital, $47,322. Victoria sat up in bed, suddenly alert despite the headache. She read the transaction details 3 times, certain she was misunderstanding something. People didn't spend windfall money on hospital bills. They bought things, objects, experiences, entertainment. This made no sense. She checked for other transactions. There were none yet. Just this single massive payment to a children's hospital, processed at 2:43 in the morning while she'd been asleep. Her first instinct was fraud. Someone had stolen the card from Marcus and was running a medical billing scam, but that didn't track either. The payment had cleared through legitimate channels, showing up as a valid transaction with patient account numbers and proper billing codes. She could see the exact breakdown: cardiac catheterization, VSD monitoring, specialist consultations, prescribed medications. Victoria opened her laptop and searched for information about what could possibly cost $47,000 at a children's hospital. The results made her stomach tighten: cardiac surgery, cancer treatment, chronic illness management, the kinds of bills that arrived when something was seriously wrong with a child. When parents would pay anything to keep their sons or daughters alive when insurance covered only a fraction, and the rest accumulated into debt that destroyed families financially while they fought to save them medically. Marcus had a sick child. He had a sick child and $47,000 in medical debt, and she'd handed him her credit card as a joke. Victoria's champagne headache intensified into something that felt like shame, an unfamiliar sensation that made her want to look away from her own reflection in the bathroom mirror. She tried to reconstruct the previous evening with clearer memory. Marcus at the registration table, quietly informed of the $100 minimum donation, standing frozen with embarrassment. Her own impulse to intervene, not from kindness, but from the desire to prove something, to demonstrate the vast distance between her world and his, to entertain her friends with a story about generosity that cost her nothing emotionally, even if the monetary amount was theoretically unlimited. A second transaction notification appeared at 9:30. Property management company in Dorchester, $4,850. Marcus was preventing eviction, keeping a roof over his daughter's head. Not gambling, not shopping, not celebrating his unexpected windfall, just addressing the immediate crises that threatened his family's survival. More notifications followed throughout the morning. Electric company, pharmacy, grocery store. Each one a necessity rather than a luxury, each one revealing the scaffolding of a life held together by duct tape and desperation. Victoria tracked them from her apartment, the view of the river and the city suddenly feeling obscene in its privilege. She'd never worried about electricity being shut off, never chosen between medication and food, never faced the arithmetic of poverty where every expense competed against every other need. By noon, she'd seen enough to understand that Marcus Hayes wasn't the person she'd assumed he was. He wasn't proving her right about poor people's lack of financial discipline. He was proving her wrong about everything. The recognition landed like a physical blow, knocking loose assumptions she'd built her entire worldview upon. Her phone rang at 3:47. American Express Security Department, the caller ID announced. Victoria answered with a sense of inevitability. "Miss Bradford, this is Derek Thompson from Account Security. We're seeing some unusual activity on your Platinum card and wanted to verify these are authorized transactions." The voice carried a Boston accent softened by professional training, concern, wrapped in corporate courtesy. "They're authorized." A pause, the kind that suggested the representative was consulting notes or conferring with a supervisor. "I understand, but the pattern is quite atypical for your spending history. Large payments to a hospital, a property management company in a low-income neighborhood, various utilities. It appears someone may be using your card for bill payments rather than purchases. Are you certain this isn't fraud?" Victoria almost laughed. The bank was confused because the transactions didn't match their algorithms for either legitimate spending or typical fraud. Marcus wasn't behaving like a thief or a consumer. He was behaving like someone desperately trying to keep his family alive, and the financial system had no category for that kind of transaction. "I gave the card to someone. Voluntarily. It's complicated." The pause stretched longer this time, laden with judgment she could feel through the phone connection. "You gave your Platinum card to someone else to use." Victoria's face heated despite being alone in her apartment, embarrassment finally catching up with her actions from the night before. 24 hours, as a sort of experiment. Derek Thompson's silence communicated volumes about what he thought of that experiment. When he spoke again, his tone had shifted from concern to barely concealed disapproval. "I see. Well, the transactions are authorized then, but I should mention that the spending has exceeded your typical monthly amount by a significant margin. Would you like me to place a limit or flag further purchases?" "No, let it continue." After the call ended, Victoria sat on her designer furniture in her expensive apartment and felt the full weight of what she'd done. She'd turned a desperate father into entertainment for a party. She'd risked a child's welfare for a story she could tell her friends. She'd assumed poverty indicated moral failure rather than systemic cruelty. The next hour passed in a strange fugue state where she researched Marcus Hayes online, finding fragments of a life that had once been stable before tragedy derailed it. His LinkedIn profile ended abruptly 5 years ago. Construction foreman at Sullivan & Associates, 15 years of experience, licensed general contractor. The profile included a photo of a younger Marcus smiling at a job site surrounded by workers who looked at him with the kind of respect that indicated leadership rather than just authority. What had happened 5 years ago to end that career, Victoria could guess now, having seen the medical bills and done the math. A child's illness or a spouse's death or both. The kind of catastrophic events that destroyed middle-class stability and sent families sliding into poverty despite education and work ethic, and all the things people like Victoria believed should protect against financial ruin. She called a number she'd obtained through means she preferred not to examine too closely, leveraging connections in the hospital's development office to access patient billing information. The ethics of this barely registered against her need to understand what she'd stepped into. Marcus answered on the third ring, his voice neutral and careful. "This is Marcus Hayes. It's Victoria Bradford from the gala last night." Silence long enough that she wondered if he'd hung up. "I know who you are. The bank called. They flagged the transactions as unusual. I can explain what you've spent." His interruption was calm but firm. "I have receipts for everything. Hospital rent, utilities, prescriptions, groceries. I can document every dollar." Victoria realized he thought she was calling to accuse him of theft or excess, that he'd already prepared a defense against charges she hadn't planned to make. "That's not why I'm calling." "Then why?" She didn't have a good answer. To assuage her guilt, to understand him, to confirm that her assumptions had been wrong, Victoria settled for a truth that felt inadequate but honest. "I expected you to spend it differently." Marcus's response came without anger, just a flat acknowledgement of reality. "I know what you expected. You expected me to buy something stupid, something you could point to as proof that people like me can't handle money." Victoria tried to form a denial, but the words wouldn't come, because he was exactly right. That had been her expectation, her intention, the entire purpose of her cruel generosity. "I used it where it was needed. For my daughter. For keeping us housed and fed and alive. That's what money is for, from where I stand. I don't know what it's for from where you stand. But that's not my problem." He said it like describing the weather, stating facts without emotional investment. Victoria found his lack of resentment almost more damaging than anger would have been. He'd already assessed her, found her worldview lacking, and moved on without needing her to change or apologize or understand. "How much time do I have left?" Victoria checked her watch, calculating hours since the gala ended. "About 16 hours. Then I have work to do." He hung up without saying goodbye, leaving Victoria holding a phone and feeling smaller than she'd felt in years. She replayed his words through the evening, unable to focus on anything else. "That's what money is for, from where I stand." Such a simple statement, yet it had unsettled something fundamental in her understanding of the world. She'd never thought about what money was for. She spent it on comfort, on convenience, on the social currency of appearing wealthy among the wealthy. Her apartment existed because she could afford it, not because she needed the space. Her wardrobe rotated seasonally because fashion demanded it, not because her clothes wore out. She attended galas and fundraisers as performance, contributing to causes she never researched because the donations were tax-deductible and the social connections were valuable. Marcus Hayes used money to prevent his daughter from being denied medical care. He used money to keep a roof over their heads. He used money for food and prescriptions and electricity. These weren't choices in the way Victoria's spending represented choices. These were the bare necessities of survival made impossible by circumstances he likely hadn't chosen and couldn't escape through willpower alone. Saturday evening arrived with Victoria unable to shake her discomfort. She canceled brunch with Natalie, claiming illness that was technically true, even if the symptoms were emotional rather than physical. Instead of spending the weekend at galleries or restaurants, she found herself driving east toward Dorchester, toward an address she'd pulled from property records linked to Marcus's name. The neighborhood revealed itself in increments as she drove. Streets narrower than those in her area of the city, buildings older and less maintained. Bodega on one corner with bars on the windows, laundromat that looked unchanged since the 1980s. Children playing on a concrete patch that served as a playground. Their shouts carrying the same G as kids in better-funded parks, but their resources visibly limited. Marcus's building was a 3-story walk-up from the 1960s brick facade that needed pointing front steps with cracks that probably became treacherous in winter ice. A handwritten sign announced the elevator was out of service, though Victoria suspected it had been broken for months rather than days. She didn't enter the building, uncertain what she'd say if confronted, unsure what she was even doing here. Beyond needing to see the reality behind the transactions she'd been tracking all day. She walked along the sidewalk, slowly conscious of how her Mercedes stood out among the aging sedans and practical vehicles that lined the street. The air smelled different here, cooking spices and exhaust fumes, and something she couldn't identify, the particular scent of a neighborhood where people lived tightly packed and resources were stretched thin. Movement near the building's entrance caught her attention. Marcus emerged from the front door holding the hand of a small girl with red hair that caught the late afternoon light. She was tiny for 8 years old, moving with a careful quality that suggested she'd been taught to monitor her own body's limits. They walked slowly, Marcus's attention entirely focused on whatever she was telling him. his expression soft in a way Victoria hadn't seen at the gala. At the corner bodega, the girl pointed at something in the window. Marcus knelt to her level, speaking too quietly for Victoria to hear from her position half a block away. The girl looked at the window display, a stuffed purple elephant. Victoria realized the kind of cheap toy that probably cost $12 then back at her father. She nodded at whatever he said, and they continued walking without entering the store. Victoria watched them disappear around the corner and felt something crack open in her chest. No drama, no crisis, just ordinary life. Ordinary love, ordinary struggle, ordinary connection between a father and daughter who had only each other. Marcus had just declined to buy his daughter a $12 toy, the same amount Victoria spent on a single coffee at the cafe near her office. She drove home in silence, the Mercedes's luxury feeling obscene in ways it never had before. The leather seats, the sound system, the climate control, all of it suddenly highlighted the vast distance between her world and Marcus's, a distance measured not in miles but in casual assumptions about what constituted necessity versus luxury. Sunday morning arrived exactly 24 hours after Victoria had handed Marcus her credit card. She'd left instructions with her building's front desk, expecting him to try returning it during a staff shift change, when he might avoid unwanted attention. The doorman called up at 11:30 to announce a visitor, and Victoria said to send him up, ignoring the subtle surprise in the doorman's voice at her willingness to receive someone who clearly didn't belong in the building's usual clientele. Marcus stood just inside her apartment threshold when she opened the door, refusing to track his work boots across her pristine floors. He wore the same clothes from the gala, minus the borrowed jacket, worn jeans, flannel shirt, boots with scuff marks that spoke to years of hard use. He carried a manila folder in one hand and her platinum card in the other. Everything's documented, every transaction, every receipt. You can see exactly where it went. Victoria took the folder but didn't open it immediately. She was looking at him differently than she had at the gala. Her earlier amusement replaced by something more uncertain and uncomfortable. How much is left on the card? I don't know. I didn't check the limit. On what I spent, here's the total. He'd written a number on the folder's exterior. Hospital rent, utilities, prescriptions, groceries. Everything itemized, everything accounted for. The total was substantial, but nowhere near what an unlimited credit card could have purchased. Victoria felt the weight of his restraint, the discipline it must have taken to stop at necessity when he could have justified so much more. You didn't spend anything on yourself. Marcus's expression suggested he found the distinction meaningless. I spent it on my family, that's the same thing. I meant you didn't buy anything just because you wanted it. No luxuries, no treats, nothing frivolous. He almost laughed, a sound without humor. When was the last time you worried about whether your kid would have a place to sleep next month? When was the last time you chose between medication and groceries? Frivolous isn't something I have room for. He wasn't saying it to wound her, wasn't trying to make her feel guilty. He was genuinely asking, trying to bridge the gap between their experiences with questions that had no good answers because Victoria had never faced those choices and never would. Thank you for what you did. You probably meant it as a joke, and I don't care. You gave me a chance to take care of my daughter, and I used it. He turned toward the door, clearly considering the transaction complete. Victoria's voice stopped him before he reached the threshold. Wait, I want to know something. At the gala, when I offered you the card, what did you think? Marcus considered the question, his expression suggesting he was deciding how much truth to share. I thought you were trying to humiliate me. I thought you wanted a story to tell your friends about the poor man who couldn't control himself around money. I thought about refusing. Why didn't you? Because my daughter needed heart surgery follow-up I couldn't afford, because we were about to be evicted, because pride is a luxury too, and I don't have room for that either. He met her eyes directly, and Victoria saw something in his gaze that made her want to look away, not anger, but a clear-eyed assessment that found her lacking. You wanted to prove something about people like me. I wanted to prove something too. That money isn't the measure of a person's worth. That how someone spends matters more than how much they have. That being poor doesn't mean being foolish or greedy or less than human. He paused at the doorway. I think I proved my point better than you proved yours. Marcus left without waiting for a response, his boots echoing in the hallway outside her apartment. Victoria stood holding the folder she was afraid to open, knowing it would contain proof of everything she'd gotten wrong, evidence of a man who'd been handed unlimited resources and chosen only what he genuinely needed. The folder sat on her coffee table for 3 days before she found the courage to examine its contents. When she finally opened it, she discovered exactly what Marcus had promised: meticulous documentation of every transaction. Payment confirmation from Boston Children's Hospital, showing the cardiac care balance reduced to 0. Receipt from the property management company for 3 months of back rent plus late fees. Utility statements showing accounts brought current. Pharmacy records for pediatric cardiac medications. A grocery receipt listing eggs, bread, milk, vegetables, modest amounts of chicken. Nothing extravagant, nothing wasteful, nothing that couldn't be justified as basic survival. At the bottom of the folder, Marcus had included something unexpected. A photograph of his daughter printed on regular paper from a home printer. She had red hair and freckles, a shy smile that suggested she'd been coaxed into posing for the picture. She was holding a stuffed rabbit, purple fabric faded from washing. On the back of the photo, Marcus had written in careful handwriting, "Her name is Rosalie. She's 8. Her mother, Kate, died during her own heart surgery when Rosie was 3. Thank you for helping keep her father out of medical debt long enough to watch her grow up. M.H." Victoria stared at the words until they blurred. Rosie's mother had died during her own heart surgery. Not Rosie's surgery. Kate had the same genetic heart defect as their daughter, and she died trying to fix it. Marcus had lost his wife while trying to save her, then spent 5 years drowning in medical bills from both of them while raising a sick child alone, and Victoria had handed him her credit card as a joke. The specific shame of being fundamentally wrong about something important settled into Victoria's bones. She'd laughed with her friends about what frivolous things the poor man would waste money on. She'd expected to feel superior, vindicated in her assumptions about poverty and character. Instead, she felt small, cruel in the careless way of people who'd never needed to consider the weight of their words or the consequences of their entertainment. The joke she'd made at Marcus's expense wasn't funny. It had never been funny. She'd risked a child's welfare for a story, and only Marcus's discipline had prevented disaster. What if he'd been the person she'd expected? What if he'd maxed her card on luxuries? She would have canceled it, probably pressed charges, definitely confirmed every bias she held about poor people and money management. And Rosie would still be facing medical debt and eviction still. One crisis away from catastrophe. Victoria heard her own voice from the gala echoing in memory her description of Marcus's face, her speculation about casinos and bad choices. She saw her friends nodding comfortable in their shared assumptions, never questioning whether their worldview might be incomplete or wrong. She'd been cruel not violently or intentionally, but in the casual way of people who'd never faced consequences for being wrong about the vulnerable. She'd treated a desperate father as entertainment and called it generosity. She'd turned his crisis into a social experiment. She'd assumed poverty indicated character failure rather than circumstance. Every assumption had been wrong. Every judgment unfair, every moment of amusement at his expense now recontextualized as cruelty. She couldn't take back. Victoria understood now that money alone couldn't fix what she'd broken. She could write checks all day and never address the fundamental failure of her own perception. Marcus didn't need her charity. He needed to be seen as what he actually was, a father who'd sacrificed everything for his daughter, who'd been offered unlimited resources and spent them on necessities, who had more financial discipline under pressure than Victoria had ever needed to develop. She began formulating a different approach. Not redemption, not charity, not guilt-driven gestures. Something that recognized Marcus's actual worth rather than trying to assuage her own discomfort. But how to offer that without it feeling like pity, and would Marcus even let her try after what she'd done? The photograph of Rosie stayed on Victoria's coffee table, a reminder of the real person behind the transactions she'd treated as data points in her social experiment. An 8-year-old girl with her mother's red hair and a father who'd proven himself better than Victoria in every way that actually mattered. The weight of that recognition felt like something permanent. A crack in the foundation of Victoria's worldview that couldn't be repaired, only rebuilt from different materials entirely. The week following the credit card incident passed with Victoria trapped in a paralysis she couldn't name. Bradford Properties occupied the 23rd floor of a glass tower in the financial district, and its offices designed to communicate permanence and success through mahogany paneling and original artwork that cost more than most people's houses. Victoria sat at her desk staring at spreadsheets for the West Side Heights project in Roxbury, unable to focus on numbers that should have demanded her attention. The project represented her father's test of her capabilities. Bradford Properties had acquired an abandoned industrial building for conversion into residential units marketed as affordable housing, though the phrase felt increasingly hollow the more Victoria examined the economics. The development budget stretched to $12 million with an 18-month timeline, but construction bids were arriving 40% over projections. General contractors kept specifying high-end finishes, granite countertops, floor-to-ceiling windows, hardwood throughout, without understanding that affordable meant something different than luxury wearing a modest label. Richard Bradford had summoned her to his corner office Tuesday morning, his expression carrying the particular patience of a man accustomed to waiting for his daughter to demonstrate competence she'd never needed to develop. "The Roxbury project is bleeding money before we've broken ground. Figure it out. This is your chance to prove you belong in leadership rather than just inheriting it." Victoria nodded and returned to her desk where Rosie's photograph sat propped against her computer monitor. A constant reminder of her failure to understand what value actually meant. She'd carried the photo from her apartment, unable to leave it behind, but uncertain why keeping it visible mattered. The girl's shy smile and faded purple rabbit accused her every time she glanced away from spreadsheets. Natalie called Wednesday afternoon, her voice bright with the kind of energy that came from never questioning one's place in the world. "So what happened with your social experiment? Did Casino Man blow through everything in 6 hours like Blake predicted?" Victoria's throat tightened around words that wouldn't form properly. "No, he used it responsibly." The silence on Natalie's end stretched long enough to become uncomfortable. "Responsibly how? Medical bills, rent, utilities, nothing frivolous." Another pause, this one laden with incomprehension. Natalie existed in the same bubble Victoria had occupied until recently, where poverty was a theoretical concept explained by character defects rather than systemic failures. "That's unexpected. Good for him, I guess. Very responsible." The conversation moved to other topics, an upcoming benefit auction, speculation about mutual friends' relationships, plans for Thanksgiving in the Berkshires, but Victoria couldn't engage with her previous enthusiasm. The concerns that had consumed her attention weeks ago now felt trivial, embarrassing in their insignificance. She ended the call early, claiming work pressure, and returned to staring at construction bids that made no sense economically. Friday evening arrived with Victoria still at the office reviewing contractor proposals. Most of her colleagues had left by 6, heading to weekend plans that didn't include wrestling with budgets that refused to balance. She was drafting an email to her Uncle Thomas about cutting scope when her phone rang with a call from the building management office of Riverside Tower, her residential building. "Miss Bradford, we have a situation. Main water pipe burst on floor 12, flooding multiple units, including yours. We've called emergency services but can't reach anyone on a Friday night before a holiday weekend. Water damage is accumulating by the minute." Victoria grabbed her coat and ran for the elevator, the crisis cutting through her week of paralysis with the clarity of immediate necessity. 20 minutes later, she stood in her building's lobby watching residents evacuate apartments with hastily gathered belongings, water stains spreading across the ceiling above the mailboxes. The building manager paced near the front desk phone pressed to his ear, increasingly frantic as each call failed to reach an available emergency contractor. No one's answering. It's the Columbus Day weekend, everyone's gone or charging triple rates and still can't come until Tuesday. Victoria watched water drip through a recessed light fixture and calculated the damage accumulating with each passing minute. 50,000, 75,000, hundreds of thousands in repairs, if the flooding wasn't stopped quickly. Her mind raced through options, none of them good. A figure moved past the lobby windows, pausing when he noticed the commotion inside. Marcus Hayes stood on the sidewalk in his work jacket, tool belt visible at his waist, expression shifting from curiosity to assessment as he pieced together what was happening. He entered the building before Victoria could process the coincidence of his presence. What's going on? The building manager barely glanced at him, too focused on his phone to register help arriving from an unexpected source. Burst pipe flooding 3 apartments. Can't find a plumber until Tuesday. Marcus moved toward the stairs without asking permission. Where's the main shutoff? Which floor is flooding? The manager looked up, finally noticing Marcus's tool belt and the confidence in his bearing. Who are you? Licensed contractor. I can help. Where's your shutoff valve? The manager hesitated, looking to Victoria for guidance. She nodded, understanding in that moment what Marcus was offering and why. Not charity, not obligation, but the simple response of someone who saw a problem he could solve and chose to act. Basement mechanical room. But if you shut off the main, the whole building loses water all weekend. Marcus was already moving toward the basement stairs, Victoria following despite the manager's protests about liability. The mechanical room smelled of rust and mildew, pipes running along walls in configurations that would have been incomprehensible to most people. Marcus scanned the layout with practiced efficiency, tracing connections with his eyes before moving to examine valves and gauges. Main shutoff here. But you're right, closing it kills water for the entire building. Better option is isolating floor 12. This secondary valve feeds floors 11 through 15. Close it and only those floors lose service. Rest of the building stays functional. The building manager had followed them down, now looking at Marcus with dawning hope. How long to fix it? Can't replace the pipe until suppliers open Monday, but I can bypass the damaged section, restore water to the other floors tonight. 2 hours if I have the right materials and someone to help carry. Victoria spoke before conscious thought caught up. I'll drive. Tell me what you need. They took her Mercedes through early evening traffic toward a commercial hardware supplier in Dorchester, the drive marked by silence that felt different than the confrontation from their last conversation. Marcus gave directions in short phrases, his attention seemingly focused on the route, but Victoria caught him glancing at her with an expression she couldn't read. Why did you stop when you saw the building? His answer came slowly, as if he was deciding how much honesty to offer. Because people needed help and I could provide it. You don't owe me anything after what I did. This isn't about you. This is about not letting people suffer when I have skills to prevent it. The words landed with the weight of a distinction. Victoria was learning to recognize the difference between action driven by guilt and action driven by capability. Marcus wasn't helping to make her feel better. He was helping because he could, because someone needed his expertise, because letting a solvable problem remain unsolved violated something fundamental in his character. They drove another 3 blocks before he spoke again. And maybe I wanted to prove something. That I'm not a charity case. I'm a professional with expertise worth paying for. The hardware store occupied a corner lot, fluorescent signs advertising commercial supplies and contractor discounts. Marcus navigated the aisles like someone who'd spent years learning the geography of tools and materials, selecting copper piping and compression fittings with the confidence of deep familiarity. An older man with white hair and an Irish lilt emerged from the back office, his face splitting into a genuine smile when he recognized Marcus. Haven't seen you in months, son. How's that little girl of yours? Frank Donnelly owned the store. That much was clear from the proprietary way he moved through the space and knew the inventory without checking computers. He had the build of someone who'd done physical labor most of his life. shoulders still broad despite being well into his 60s, hands that looked like they'd held every tool in the store at some point. "Rosie's managing. Heart's stable for now." Frank's expression softened with the particular sympathy of someone who'd known tragedy personally. "Give her my best. You need help loading all this?" Marcus glanced at Victoria, hesitation visible in the set of his shoulders. "No, I've got help. Put it on my account." Victoria interjected quietly. "Put it on mine. For the building repair." Marcus looked like he wanted to argue, but after a moment he nodded. Frank rang up the purchase while explaining to Victoria that Marcus had done excellent work on his daughter's basement renovation 2 years ago. That everyone in the neighborhood knew Marcus was the guy you called when you needed something done right the first time. The praise made Marcus uncomfortable in a way that suggested he wasn't used to having his competence acknowledged by people outside his immediate circle. The drive back to Riverside Tower filled with conversation that felt different than their previous exchanges. Victoria asked about the materials he'd selected, genuinely curious rather than performing interest. Marcus explained the logic behind each choice: type M copper for residential applications, compression fittings for accessible joints that might need future service, solder for permanent connections. He described his approach with the clarity of someone who'd spent years teaching apprentices, breaking down complex decisions into comprehensible reasoning. Construction is problem-solving in real time. Every building is different. Blueprints are theory. Actual plumbing is reality. You have to adapt to what you find when you open the walls. Victoria found herself engaged in a way her work at Bradford Properties never achieved. Marcus talked about buildings like they were living entities with histories and personalities, structures that communicated their needs to anyone willing to pay attention. His hands moved while he spoke, unconsciously illustrating points with gestures that suggested muscle memory from decades of physical work. Back at the building, Marcus set up a workspace in the mechanical room, while Victoria held flashlights and steadied pipes according to his instructions. He worked with economical precision, no wasted motion, each action purposeful and efficient. The torch flame heated copper until solder flowed into joints through capillary action, creating bonds that would last decades. Victoria watched his hands transform raw materials into functional solutions, the kind of practical competence she'd never needed to develop. "Hold this steady while I solder. Don't move until I say." She gripped the pipe section, feeling heat radiate from the copper, conscious of Marcus's proximity as he worked. His focus was absolute attention, narrowed to the task with an intensity that made everything else fade into background noise. This was Marcus in his element, demonstrating expertise that couldn't be faked or purchased or inherited through family connections. 2 hours later, the bypass was complete. Marcus tested the new configuration, slowly turning valves incrementally to avoid pressure spikes. Water flowed through the repaired section without leaks, steady and clean. The building manager tested faucets on floors 13 through 15, confirming restoration of service. Floor 12 remained offline pending full pipe replacement Monday, but the building was functional rather than crippled by emergency. Victoria approached the manager with instructions she delivered in a tone that didn't invite negotiation. "Pay him emergency contractor rate, double time for after-hours work." Marcus started to protest, but Victoria overrode him. "You saved the building from $50,000 in additional damage. Double time is fair." The manager wrote a check for $840, 2 hours at $420 per hour. Marcus accepted it with visible relief that made Victoria's chest ache with recognition of how significant that amount was to someone living paycheck to paycheck. First legitimate payment he'd probably received in weeks, earned through skill rather than charity, proof of his value in concrete terms that no one could dismiss. He washed soldering flux from his hands at a utility sink, the simple action somehow intimate in its domesticity. Victoria watched him and understood with sudden clarity what he needed: not charity, not guilt money, but legitimate work at fair rates for valuable skills. The recognition felt like a door opening onto possibilities she hadn't considered before. Saturday morning found Victoria composing a text message she revised 7 times before sending. The proposition felt risky, potentially insulting given their history, but the Roxbury project desperately needed someone who understood actual construction economics rather than theoretical budgets. "Can we talk about work, not about the card? I have a project." Marcus's response came 2 hours later, long enough that Victoria assumed he'd declined. When her phone finally chimed, the message was characteristically direct. "Rosie's Diner on Dorchester Ave, 10 a.m. You come to my neighborhood." The diner occupied a corner lot that had probably been a family restaurant since the 1950s. Its red vinyl booths and formica counters unchanged for decades. The Donnelly family ran it, Frank's sister-in-law, and her daughters, all of them carrying the same Irish lilt that made Victoria feel like she'd stepped into a different Boston than the one she usually inhabited. Marcus sat in a booth near the back when she arrived, mug of black coffee already cooling in front of him. Victoria slid into the opposite seat, conscious of how her cashmere sweater and designer jeans stood out among the working-class breakfast crowd. She'd tried to dress down, but her clothes still cost more than anyone else's in the diner, combined privilege written in fibers and stitching, no matter how casual the style. "You came. You asked me to, and I owe you a conversation." Victoria ordered coffee. She didn't want buying time to organize thoughts that felt inadequate to the moment. How to make this proposition without it sounding like charity. How to acknowledge what she needed without diminishing what he could offer. "My company has a project in Roxbury, converting an old industrial building to affordable housing. Construction bids are coming in 40% over budget. Contractors are specifying high-end finishes without understanding what affordable actually means. I need someone who gets value engineering. Real construction economics, not luxury condos wearing a modest label." Marcus's expression remained neutral, giving nothing away. "You need a construction consultant. I need you." The statement hung between them, weighted with meanings Victoria hadn't intended but couldn't retract. Marcus leaned back against the vinyl booth, studying her with the same assessing gaze from the gala, trying to determine if this was genuine need or another game. "This is charity. No, this is business need. The project is failing without real expertise. You have contractors bidding. Hire one of them." Victoria shook her head, frustration sharpening her voice. "They don't understand. They're thinking $200 per square foot finishes. I need $80 per square foot that doesn't look cheap. That takes someone who's built under budget constraints, someone who knows value." She outlined the position: consulting role, reviewing plans, identifying cost-saving opportunities, advising on materials and methods. $85 per hour, 30 hours per week, guaranteed for 6 months, benefits after 90 days. The math worked out to over $10,000 per month, more than Marcus had made as a foreman, enough to rebuild financial stability and provide the security Rosie needed. Marcus sat silent, calculating numbers in his head, weighing the offer against the history between them. Victoria could see him processing whether this was real or guilt-driven, whether accepting would compromise the point he'd proven about his worth. "Why me specifically? Don't lie." Victoria chose honesty, the only currency that had value in this negotiation. "Because you proved you understand value better than anyone I know. Because you spent $47,000 on survival and nothing on luxury. That's the mindset this project needs. And because you're right. I was wrong about you. I want to fix that by recognizing what you actually are: a skilled professional." Marcus countered with terms that transformed the dynamic. 3-month trial. If the project doesn't benefit from my input, we end it. No hard feelings. I work on my terms. I won't be your redemption project or paraded around as your charity case. I give honest input even if you don't want to hear it. And I don't attend galas or social events. This is professional only. Deal. They shook hands across the formica table, the contact brief but significant. Marcus's palm was rough with calluses, his grip firm without being aggressive. The handshake of someone accustomed to sealing agreements with personal integrity rather than contracts. Victoria's hand felt small in his, her manicured nails and smooth skin a visible reminder of their different lives. Small footsteps approached from the diner's back room where the Donnelly daughters had apparently been entertaining her. Rosie appeared clutching crayons and a coloring book, her red hair pulled into pigtails that made her look even younger than 8. She ran to Marcus with the careful gait of a child monitoring her own exertion, and he caught her easily lifting her onto his lap. "Daddy, Mrs. Donnelly gave me hot chocolate. Did you say thank you?" "Yes, 3 times. Rosie noticed Victoria, then her expression shifting to cautious curiosity. Children with chronic illness learned early to read adults for signs of danger or discomfort, and Rosie clearly possessed that particular wariness. "Who's that?" "This is Miss Bradford. She's going to work with Daddy on a project." Rosie studied Victoria with disconcerting directness. "Are you nice to my daddy?" The question landed like an accusation, and Victoria struggled to find an answer that was both honest and appropriate for a child. "I'm trying to be." Rosie considered this with the gravity of someone making an important decision. "Okay, but if you're mean, I'll be mad at you." Victoria smiled despite the tightness in her throat. "That's fair." Monday morning, Victoria introduced Marcus to the Bradford Properties team in the conference room overlooking the financial district. Ken Davies, the project manager, stood near the window with arms crossed, his body language broadcasting skepticism about this sudden consultant hire. Lauren Mitchell, the lead architect, sat at the table with her portfolio of renderings spread out like ammunition. Thomas Bradford occupied the head of the table, his expression suggesting he'd reserve judgment until Marcus proved himself worth the expense. Marcus reviewed the architectural plans in silence, his face betraying nothing as he examined floor layouts and finished specifications. The renderings showed beautiful spaces, floor-to-ceiling windows flooding units with natural light. Gleaming countertops, hardwood floors that would photograph well for marketing materials. After 10 minutes, he spoke with the bluntness Victoria had warned everyone to expect. "This isn't affordable housing. This is luxury housing you're calling affordable." "What's the target rent?" Victoria answered before anyone else could frame the response more diplomatically. $1,400 per month for a 2-bedroom. Marcus pulled a contractor's calculator from his jacket and started running numbers, his fingers moving with practiced speed. "At current spec, you'll need $2,200 monthly just to break even. Granite counters, $85 per square foot installed. Laminate, that looks like granite, $35. Floor-to-ceiling windows, custom size, $800 each. Standard windows with extended framing, $250. Hardwood throughout, $12 per square foot. Luxury vinyl plank that mimics hardwood, $4. He looked up from the calculator, meeting Lauren's defensive gaze directly. "You're spending $80,000 per unit on aesthetics that don't add function. Multiply by 40 units, 3.2 million wasted." Lauren's voice carried the particular edge of someone whose creative vision was being challenged by practical reality. "But the visual quality will look great to people who can't afford to live there. You're building for photographers, not families." Ken Davies moved from the window, his skepticism shifting toward interest despite himself. "So you want us to cheap out on everything?" "No, I want you to spend money where it matters. Structure, insulation, water heaters, HVAC. Things residents actually use. Save money on things they don't care about. Countertop material doesn't matter if rent is too high to qualify." Thomas Bradford leaned forward, his attention fully engaged now. "Show us what you'd do differently." Marcus spent the next 3 hours with Lauren redrawing finished specifications while preserving her floor plans. The layout worked. She'd designed functional spaces that used square footage efficiently. But every material choice got reconsidered through the lens of value rather than appearance. Standard windows instead of custom, luxury vinyl plank instead of hardwood, quartz composite instead of granite, paint instead of tile in bathrooms. The revised specifications saved $78,000 per unit. Multiplied across 40 units, the project came in $3.12 million under original budget. Lauren grudgingly admitted the units would still look good, professional, without appearing cheap. Ken confirmed the numbers worked. Thomas Bradford asked the question everyone was thinking. Where did you find this guy? Victoria met her uncle's gaze without flinching. He found me. Wednesday afternoon, Marcus and Victoria toured the Roxbury building site, the structure looming 6 stories above the street brick facade stained with decades of neglect and weather. Graffiti covered the ground floor walls, windows were broken or missing entirely. Pigeons had taken up residence in the upper floors. But the bones were solid 1920s construction, meant brick-bearing walls and heavy timber joists built before cost-cutting became standard practice. Marcus moved through the space with reverent attention, testing walls for stability, examining ceiling joists for rot, checking the foundation for settling. His hands touched the building, constantly reading information through tactile feedback in ways Victoria was beginning to understand. Mattered as much as visual inspection. This wall is load-bearing, this one isn't. You can open this space up without compromising structure. See these floor joists? They held industrial equipment. Expose them structural and aesthetic at once. Don't cover them with drop ceilings. Victoria followed him through dusty rooms that smelled of mildew and abandonment, watching him transform empty space into imagined possibility. She'd spent her career looking at buildings as spreadsheets, square footage calculations, rental income projections, return on investment models. Marcus saw them as structures with histories and potential entities that communicated their stories to anyone willing to listen properly. On the 3rd floor, Marcus tested a section of flooring that looked questionable. Wood cracked beneath Victoria's weight without warning, the board giving way suddenly. She stumbled sideways, off balance and heading toward a weak section that might not hold her. Marcus caught her arm before she could fall, pulling her back from the damaged area with reflexes honed by years on construction sites where inattention could kill. For a moment they stood close, his hand still on her forearm, her palm braced against his chest for balance. Victoria felt his heart beating steady beneath her hand, felt the solidity of muscle and bone beneath flannel shirt and work jacket. His eyes met hers, and something passed between them that had nothing to do with construction or professional consulting. Recognition of awareness, possibility, danger of a different kind than rotted flooring. Marcus released her and stepped back, his expression closing down into professional neutrality. Watch your step, lots of rot up here. We need a structural engineer to assess floor loading capacity before we do anything else. They continued the tour with new tension threading through their interactions. An awareness that made Victoria hyper-conscious of proximity and eye contact, and the way Marcus explained building details with hands that moved expressively while he spoke. On the roof, reached via a sketchy ladder Marcus tested thoroughly before allowing her to climb, they stood looking out over Roxbury and the distant skyline of downtown Boston. Victoria's apartment building was visible as a glass tower catching afternoon light. Marcus pointed toward it without needing to ask which building was hers. We're 4 miles apart, might as well be different planets. The observation carried no resentment, just acknowledgement of reality neither of them could change through wishing. Victoria looked at the distance between her building and where they stood, measuring the gap in more than geography. I never came to this neighborhood before that night I drove to your apartment. Never had reason to. Never thought about who lived here or what their lives were like. I know. The simple agreement stung more than accusation would have. Marcus knew because people like Victoria were visible in their absence from neighborhoods like his, their privilege written in all the places they never needed to go and the people they never needed to see. I've been thinking about what you said, about money being for different things depending on where you stand. I want to understand your perspective. Not to fix you or save you, to actually understand. Marcus was quiet long enough that Victoria thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried weight of memory and loss that made her chest ache. When Rosie was 4, she needed her first catheterization. $15,000, I had $2,000 in savings, maxed credit cards, set up a payment plan, took 3 years to pay off. Then she needed another procedure. Every choice after that, medication or groceries, heat or electricity, rent or hospital bill. You never think about that because you never have to. He turned to face her, and Victoria saw past his careful control to the fear underneath the constant terror of a parent responsible for keeping a medically fragile child alive on resources that would never be adequate. Kate and I used to fight about money. Not because we wanted luxury, we wanted breathing room. 1 month where we weren't deciding which bill to pay late. 1 month where Rosie could get ice cream without mental calculation. Kate died before we got that month. His voice broke slightly on the last sentence, the only crack in composure Victoria had witnessed from him. She didn't offer platitudes or comfort, recognizing that sympathy would diminish the significance of what he'd shared. Instead, she simply acknowledged the truth. "I'm sorry for what you lost, and for making a joke of what you were living through." Marcus nodded, accepting rather than dismissing the apology. Wind blew across the rooftop, carrying sounds from the street below. They stood in shared silence that felt more honest than conversation, two people from different worlds attempting to map the distance between their experiences. "This building could be good for families, if we do it right." "We? You said we." "Yeah, I guess I did." Victoria smiled, something warm and dangerous unfurling in her chest. "I like that." Thursday evening, Marcus's phone shattered the careful equilibrium they'd established over the past week. Victoria and he were reviewing cost estimates in her office, working late because the contractor bids needed response by Friday morning. His phone buzzed with a call from Rosie's school, and Victoria watched his face drain of color as he listened to words she couldn't hear. "I have to go. Rosie collapsed during after-school program. They called an ambulance. Boston Children's." He was moving before he finished speaking, grabbing his jacket and phone with the jerky motions of someone operating on pure adrenaline. Victoria grabbed her keys without asking permission. "I'll drive you. You're not in any state to drive safely." Marcus didn't argue, which told Victoria more about his fear than anything he could have said. They ran to the parking garage where her Mercedes waited, and Victoria drove with focused aggression through rush-hour traffic, using every gap and shortcut she knew. Marcus sat rigid in the passenger seat, phone clutched in white-knuckled grip, breathing too fast. He called Mrs. Sullivan to explain, his voice shaking despite efforts to stay calm. "They took Rosie to Children's. I'm on my way. Can you? Thank you." The emergency entrance at Boston Children's Hospital was familiar enough that Marcus navigated without conscious thought, muscle memory from previous crises, guiding him through automatic doors and past the reception desk. A nurse directed them to the cardiac monitoring unit, room 8. Rosie lay in a hospital bed surrounded by machines that beeped and hummed, oxygen cannula in her nose. IV line taped to her small hand. She looked pale and scared, but tried to smile when Marcus rushed through the door. "Daddy, I'm okay. I just got dizzy." Marcus pulled a chair to her bedside, taking her free hand, with a gentleness that contrasted with the panic still visible in his face. Victoria stood near the door, uncertain whether she should leave or stay, unwilling to intrude but unable to walk away. Dr. James Whitaker entered with a tablet showing readouts Victoria couldn't interpret. The cardiologist was in his mid-40s with graying hair and the calm demeanor of someone who delivered serious news regularly enough to have perfected the delivery. "Marcus, good you made it quickly. Rosie experienced an arrhythmia episode. Her VSD is causing irregular heartbeat under stress. Not immediately dangerous, but we need to keep her overnight for monitoring. We may need to adjust her medication dosage, possibly schedule another cardiac catheterization next month to reassess the defect." Marcus's jaw clenched, his next words forced through visible effort to stay controlled. "Another cath. Cost, doctor?" Whitaker's expression showed he'd had this conversation with Marcus before. Knew the financial calculations that accompanied every medical recommendation. "Let's focus on Rosie's health first. We'll work out." "That means expensive." The doctor nodded, acknowledging what they both understood. Another procedure meant another $8,000 to $12,000 in bills. Marcus couldn't pay more debt, accumulating on top of what Victoria's credit card had temporarily received. Victoria watched Marcus transform in his daughter's presence, all the guardedness falling away to reveal something tender and fierce. He explained the situation to Rosie in language an 8-year-old could understand, his voice steady despite the fear underneath. Arrhythmia means your heartbeat got confused, like when you're running and you trip. We're staying here tonight so doctors can remind your heart how to beat properly. Will it hurt? No, sweetheart, just boring. You'll sleep and I'll be right here. Rosie's gaze found Victoria still standing near the door. Is she Daddy's friend? Marcus glanced at Victoria, something unreadable in his expression. Yeah, she is. Can she read stories? You're really bad at voices. Marcus almost smiled despite everything. My dragon voice is excellent. It's terrible, Daddy. The simple exchange, the normalcy of a child teasing her father even in a hospital room, made Victoria's throat tight with emotion she couldn't name. She moved to the other side of the bed, accepting the coloring book Rosie offered, and read a story about a brave elephant who wasn't afraid of anything, while Marcus held his daughter's hand and tried to believe that would be true. Hours passed in the strange compression of hospital time, where minutes stretched and compressed unpredictably. Rosie dozed with monitors beeping steady reassurance. Marcus sat rigid in the parent chair, running on adrenaline and fear. At 11 o'clock, a nurse suggested he get coffee from the cafeteria, stretch his legs, take care of himself so he could take care of Rosie. Victoria went with him, neither of them speaking as they walked to the elevator and descended to the mostly empty cafeteria, where vending machines offered coffee that tasted like burnt regret. They sat at a table near the windows overlooking the city lights, spreading in all directions, each one representing people with their own crises and joys and ordinary struggles. Marcus cradled the coffee cup without drinking, his hands needing something to grip. How often does this happen? Victoria's question came quietly, giving him permission to ignore it if talking was too difficult right now. Every few months. Usually she manages with medication. But stress triggers it. Too much activity, temperature changes, even excitement. She has to live aware every moment of her own mortality at 8 years old. She has to live carefully. She has to live conscious that her body might betray her anytime, that her heart might just stop keeping rhythm, that I can't fix it no matter how much I love her or how hard I work. The words came faster now, fear spilling over the dam of control Marcus had maintained for hours. Worst part is knowing I'm helpless. I can build buildings, repair pipes, solve structural problems, but this, I'm just watching monitors, trusting doctors, hoping medication works. Some days that doesn't feel like enough. Some days I wonder if being here is really everything, or if I'm failing her in ways I can't see. Victoria reached across the table and touched his hand briefly. You're not helpless. You're here. That is everything. She knows you'd do anything for her. Marcus looked at their hands. Victoria's already withdrawn, but the warmth of contact lingering. Something in his expression shifted the guardedness, lowering another increment. I don't hate you, Victoria. I'm angry, I'm hurt. I'm cautious as hell, but I don't hate you. The admission felt significant beyond the words themselves, permission to continue trying, acknowledgement that the space between them might contain possibility, rather than just history and mistakes. Rosie asks about you, wants to know why you stopped coming around after the hospital that night. Victoria's breath caught. What do you tell her? That adults are complicated, that people need space sometimes. She says that's stupid, that if you care about someone, you don't leave. 8-year-old wisdom, usually the most honest kind. They returned to Rosie's room, where she slept peacefully, her small form dwarfed by the hospital bed and medical equipment. Marcus settled back into the parent chair, exhaustion finally catching up with adrenaline. Victoria took the other chair, the plastic kind that turned every position uncomfortable within minutes, and decided to stay, despite Marcus not asking and her having no practical reason to remain. At 3 in the morning, with Rosie's monitors beeping steady and Marcus asleep in his chair, Victoria watched the two of them and understood something fundamental had shifted. She wasn't here out of guilt anymore. She was here because she cared about Rosie, about Marcus, about this family that had taught her what money actually meant and what mattered beyond spreadsheets and social status. The dawn would bring new decisions, more complications, the necessity of defining what existed between them. But for now, in this hospital room with its antiseptic smell and fluorescent lighting, Victoria kept vigil over people who'd become more important than professional obligation could explain. Friday morning arrived with Rosie waking to find Victoria asleep in the visitor chair. Her cashmere sweater creased and her usually perfect hair disheveled from hours in an uncomfortable position. The 8-year-old studied the sleeping woman with the assessing gaze of someone who'd learned early to evaluate whether adults could be trusted. "Daddy, she stayed all night." Marcus lifted his head from where he'd dozed against the bedrail, neck stiff and consciousness returning in stages. He looked at Victoria, then back at his daughter, seeing something in Rosie's expression that made him choose his words carefully. "Yeah, she did." Rosie's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried more weight than full volume. "She must really like you." "It's not like that, Rosie." "Why not? She's pretty and nice, and she stayed when she didn't have to." Marcus had no answer that would satisfy an 8-year-old's logic or his own growing confusion about what Victoria's presence meant. Dr. Whitaker's morning rounds interrupted the conversation, his assessment confirming what the overnight monitors had already communicated. Rosie's rhythm had stabilized, the arrhythmia episode controlled through adjusted medication. She could be discharged that afternoon with a follow-up catheterization scheduled in 4 weeks. The doctor's words about the upcoming procedure hung in the room like a debt notice. $8,000 to $12,000 depending on complexity, insurance covering only a portion, the rest becoming another weight on Marcus's shoulders. Victoria saw his jaw tighten, recognized the calculation happening behind his careful expression. They waited until Rosie was distracted by breakfast and morning television before stepping into the hallway, the antiseptic hospital smell stronger outside the room, punctuated by distant beeping and the rubber-soled shuffle of nurses making rounds. "I can help with the catheterization costs." Marcus's response was immediate and absolute. "No. Marcus, we've been here before. I won't take charity from you. Not after everything." Victoria tried another approach, her voice dropping to match his intensity. "You're working for me now. I could advance your pay. I've been working 3 weeks. Haven't earned $12,000 yet. So yes, that's charity. I appreciate the offer, but no. I'll figure it out like I always do." The finality in his tone closed the conversation before Victoria could argue further. They returned to Rosie's room where the girl was explaining to a nurse about her favorite purple elephant at home, the one named Victoria because it was special like Miss Bradford. The nurse smiled and made appropriate sounds of interest, professional kindness that didn't quite reach her eyes in the way genuine engagement would. Marcus handled discharge paperwork with the efficiency of someone who'd navigated hospital bureaucracy too many times, signing forms and scheduling follow-ups while Rosie gathered her belongings. Coloring book, stuffed rabbit, the clothes she'd been wearing when the episode happened. Victoria drove them home to Dorchester, the Friday morning traffic thick with people heading to work who didn't know and wouldn't care about the small crisis that had consumed the last 18 hours. Rosie chattered about missing school, about wanting to show her friends the hospital bracelet, about whether she could have pancakes for lunch. The normalcy of her concerns felt like a gift after the fear of watching monitors all night. Marcus responded with the careful attention of someone grateful his daughter was alive to have ordinary requests. At the apartment building, Victoria waited while Marcus carried Rosie upstairs, unwilling to leave until she knew they were settled. Mrs. Sullivan appeared in the hallway, still in her nursing scrubs, and insisted on watching Rosie so Marcus could get a few hours of real sleep. The older woman's competence and genuine affection for the child were visible in how she ushered Rosie toward her apartment with promises of cartoons and grilled cheese. Marcus returned to find Victoria still in the hallway, exhaustion written in every line of his posture. "Thank you for driving us, for staying at the hospital. You didn't have to do any of it." "I wanted to. That's different than having to." Something passed between them in the narrow hallway with its flickering fluorescent light and cooking smells from neighboring apartments. Acknowledgement of shift, recognition that professional boundaries had blurred into something neither could easily define. Marcus opened his door slightly, a gesture that might have been invitation or dismissal depending on interpretation. I should sleep. Site inspection scheduled Monday morning and I need to be functional. Victoria nodded and left, but driving back to her apartment she couldn't shake the image of Marcus holding Rosie's hand. Through the night, the fierce protectiveness and helpless fear combining in ways that made her own concerns about budgets and project timelines feel trivial by comparison. Monday morning, the Roxbury site transformed from conceptual drawings into physical reality. Demolition crews had begun removing interior walls marked as non-structural, their work creating dust clouds and the particular cacophony of destruction preceding creation. Marcus moved through the building with a hard hat and clipboard, consulting with the structural engineer about load-bearing walls and joists, making decisions that would determine whether the renovation succeeded or failed in ways invisible to future residents. Victoria visited the site Tuesday afternoon, navigating construction debris in boots she'd purchased specifically for these inspections. Marcus stood on the 4th floor with Ken Davies and the demolition foreman, pointing at exposed brick and explaining why preserving it would add character without adding cost. His authority on site was absolute in ways his authority in the conference room had needed proving. Workers deferred to his judgment, contractors checked specifications with him before proceeding. Even Ken had stopped questioning his recommendations after seeing them consistently improve the project. The brick is original 1920s construction. Clean it up, seal it, leave it exposed. Structural and aesthetic, no drywall costs, no paint. Residents will pay premium for authentic industrial character. The foreman nodded and made notes, already recalculating labor hours based on Marcus's direction. Victoria watched from the doorway, seeing him as workers saw him: competent, confident, commanding respect through expertise rather than title. This was who Marcus had been before tragedy derailed his career, and watching him reclaim that identity felt like witnessing resurrection. Her Uncle Thomas appeared behind her, his presence announced by expensive cologne and the rustle of his suit in the dusty environment. He observed Marcus for several minutes before speaking quietly enough that only Victoria could hear. "Your consultant is impressive. Where did you find him again?" "He found me. Long story." Thomas's expression suggested he'd already heard versions of that story through the office gossip network, Bradford Properties being small enough that Victoria's late-night work sessions with the new consultant hadn't gone unnoticed. "What's your relationship with him exactly? Professional or something more?" Victoria's denial came too quickly, too defensive. "Professional. He's saving the project." You watch him differently than you watch other employees. Like he matters beyond the balance sheet." Heat crept up Victoria's neck despite the construction site chill. "I respect his expertise, that's all." Thomas nodded with the expression of someone who didn't believe her but wouldn't press the point. He left to inspect the ground floor, leaving Victoria alone with the uncomfortable recognition that her feelings had become visible to observers she'd assumed were oblivious. Marcus approached from across the floor, tool belt hanging at his waist, dust coating his work clothes. He'd overheard enough of the conversation to understand what Thomas had asked, Victoria realized from the careful neutrality of his expression. "Cost analysis for Phase 2. Contractor bids came in under revised budget. We're on track." He handed her a folder thick with documentation, his fingers brushing hers briefly during the transfer. The contact lasted less than a second but felt electric with everything they weren't discussing. Marcus held her gaze for a moment before returning to the demolition foreman, leaving Victoria clutching papers and trying to remember how to breathe normally. Thursday evening, Bradford Properties hosted its quarterly dinner at a restaurant overlooking the harbor, the kind of event Victoria usually attended out of obligation rather than enthusiasm. Clients and employees gathered for networking disguised as social connection, everyone performing interest in each other's lives while calculating professional advantage. Victoria expected Marcus to decline. He'd explicitly stated no social events in his contract terms, but Thursday afternoon he sent a text that surprised her. "Rosie wants to see where I work. We'll come for an hour if that's acceptable." They arrived as appetizers were being served. Marcus in the same sport coat and slacks he'd worn to the company dinner weeks ago. Rosie in a navy dress with her red hair brushed until it shone. The girl clutched her father's hand with the careful attention of someone navigating unfamiliar social territory. Her eyes wide as she took in the restaurant's elegant interior and well-dressed crowd. Victoria intercepted them near the entrance, kneeling to Rosie's level with a smile that felt more genuine than any she'd managed with clients all evening. "I'm glad you came. Want to see the view? The harbor looks pretty at sunset." Rosie nodded shyly and allowed Victoria to lead them toward the windows where city lights were beginning to compete with fading daylight. Marcus followed, his discomfort visible in the set of his shoulders, but his attention focused on his daughter's experience rather than his own unease. Natalie Calloway materialized with Blake in tow, her expression brightening with the particular enthusiasm of someone who enjoyed being included in developing situations. She studied Marcus with dawning recognition that made Victoria's stomach clench. "Marcus, Victoria's told us about your work on the Roxbury project. So impressive what you're achieving." Blake extended his hand, his hedge fund manager persona fully engaged. "What kind of consulting exactly?" Marcus shook hands with both of them, his response measured and professional. "Value engineering for affordable housing, cost reduction without sacrificing quality or function." "Fascinating. Must be challenging in the current construction market." "It is. But that's what makes it worthwhile, creating housing people can actually afford to live in." The conversation continued in that vain surface-level professional, until Rosie tugged on Marcus's sleeve with a whispered request about food. Natalie directed them toward the buffet where the restaurant had set up a children's section with less adventurous options, and Blake drifted toward other conversations, leaving Victoria and Natalie momentarily alone. Natalie's voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper. "That's him, isn't it? Your credit card guy from the gala." Victoria considered lying but recognized futility. "Yes. You hired him after that, Victoria. This looks like you're trying to assuage guilt or something else. He's genuinely qualified. The project succeeds because of his expertise, not despite it." Natalie's expression softened into something approaching concern. "Does he know you have feelings for him? Because you do, obviously. It's written all over how you look at him." Victoria had no response that wouldn't be either a lie or an admission she wasn't ready to voice. Natalie squeezed her arm with surprising gentleness. "Just be careful. The power dynamics are complicated enough without adding romance." Later, after Marcus and Rosie had left with promises that the girl could visit the construction site someday, Victoria stood at the harbor windows and acknowledged what she'd been avoiding. She had feelings for Marcus that went beyond respect or professional admiration. Feelings that complicated everything and made the power imbalance between them even more problematic than it already was. Friday morning brought a text from Marcus that felt different in tone from his usual professional communications. "Can we talk not about work?" Victoria suggested meeting at Rosie's diner, neutral territory that had worked before. His response came quickly. "Not a good idea." Her heart sank before his next message appeared. "Need to be honest with you. Tomorrow noon, same place, please come." Saturday morning crawled past with Victoria unable to focus on anything beyond the upcoming conversation. She arrived at the diner 15 minutes early, ordering coffee she didn't want, and rehearsing various scenarios in her head. Marcus appeared exactly at noon, his expression closed in ways that suggested he'd spent the intervening hours preparing for confrontation. He slid into the booth across from her, declining the waitress's offer of coffee. His hands flat on the formica surface like he needed the physical contact to ground himself. "I need to tell you something, and I need you to let me finish before you respond." Victoria nodded, her throat suddenly too tight for speech. "When I gave you that credit card back, it was cruel what you did. Testing me like an experiment, turning my desperation into entertainment. You proved yourself wrong in every way, and for a while I wanted to make amends, find some way to fix the damage." He paused, gathering words that clearly didn't come easy. "Working with you these past weeks, watching you with Rosie at the hospital, something changed. This isn't about guilt anymore for either of us. I care about you. Both of you. Victoria's chest loosened slightly, relief beginning to surface before Marcus continued and destroyed whatever hope had been building. But I know what you did after the gala. I know you investigated me. LinkedIn searches hospital records, access property records. You got my phone number from patient billing. Someone called from compliance about unauthorized information requests regarding Rosie. I put it together. The blood drained from Victoria's face as the full weight of her privacy violations crystallized into consequences she'd been avoiding. Marcus's voice remained level, but his words cut with surgical precision. You invaded my privacy, dug into medical history without permission, drove to my neighborhood to surveil me. You think that's caring, that's control, that's treating me like a project you're studying rather than a person with boundaries that matter. I was trying to understand. You understand by asking, not by investigating. But you couldn't ask because that would require seeing me as equal instead of subject. Victoria tried to formulate defense, but every word she considered sounded hollow against the truth of his accusation. She had violated his privacy, had used connections and resources to access information she had no right to possess, had justified it through curiosity she'd labeled as caring. Marcus stood, his decision clearly made before arriving. I'm finishing the Roxbury project because I committed to it. After that, I'm done with Bradford Properties. I can't work for someone who sees me as charity case or therapy assignment or research subject. Thank you for the opportunity, but we're done. He left money for coffee he hadn't drunk and walked out of the diner without waiting for response. Victoria sat alone in the booth, her reflection visible in the window, showing someone who'd systematically destroyed something valuable through the same privilege and entitlement she'd been trying to move beyond. The drive back to her apartment passed in a fog of self-recrimination. Marcus was right about everything, the privacy violations, the control masquerading as concern, the inability to approach him as equal. She'd spent weeks congratulating herself on growth while still operating from the same assumptions that had made the credit card joke seem acceptable. Recognizing her mistake didn't undo the harm, and apologizing wouldn't restore trust she'd systematically undermined. 2 weeks passed, with Marcus continuing project work through email and written reports, avoiding Victoria at site visits by scheduling his inspections for times she wasn't expected. The professional distance felt like physical cold, a reminder of what she'd broken through, carelessness disguised as care. Bradford Properties hummed with speculation about the falling out between Victoria and her consultant, but no one asked directly and she offered no explanations. The Roxbury building progressed toward completion despite the personal wreckage surrounding it. 40 units taking shape according to Marcus's vision of affordable housing that didn't sacrifice dignity for economy. Families had pre-leased most of the apartments based on floor plans and finish samples, proving the market existed for housing designed around actual need rather than luxury cosplay. Victoria's father found her in her office late on a Tuesday evening, the city lights below creating patterns she'd stopped noticing through familiarity. Richard Bradford rarely visited her workspace, preferring to summon people to his domain rather than entering theirs. His presence announced something significant enough to break pattern. You've been distracted for weeks. Want to tell me what's actually going on? Victoria considered deflecting, but recognized her father would see through superficial responses. I hurt someone I care about, someone important, and I don't know how to fix it. Richard pulled up a chair, his expression softening into something approaching paternal concern rather than executive evaluation. The consultant, Marcus? She nodded, not trusting her voice. I've been watching this company for 30 years. I know when someone's falling for someone else. What happened? Victoria explained without minimizing her mistakes, the initial cruelty at the gala, the privacy violations after the pattern of approaching Marcus from positions of power rather than partnership. Richard listened without interrupting, his face revealing nothing until she finished. You can't fix people, Victoria. You can only show them who you are through consistent action. If he's worth having, he's worth waiting for, worth proving yourself to over time. But how? He won't let me near him now. What does he value? Not what you think he should value. What does he actually demonstrate caring about through his choices? Victoria considered the question seriously, reviewing months of observations. Responsibility, fatherhood, integrity, hard work, taking care of Rosie, building things that matter. Then prove you respect those values, not with words or money, but through your own actions and choices. Show him you've learned what he tried to teach you. The advice felt both obvious and impossible, a path forward she couldn't yet see clearly but knew existed somewhere beyond immediate visibility. She thanked her father and returned to staring at city lights, turning his words over in her mind until they began suggesting practical applications. 6 weeks after Marcus had walked out of the diner, the Roxbury project reached completion. 40 units finished 3 weeks ahead of schedule and $3.1 million under original budget. Every penny of savings redirected toward amenities that actually mattered. Playground equipment, community room, furniture, upgraded appliances in each unit. Local news covered the opening as a success story about affordable housing done right. And Bradford Properties scheduled a celebration event for stakeholders and press. Victoria prepared remarks for the event, standing in front of her bedroom mirror and practicing delivery. The speech she'd originally written focused on Bradford Properties' commitment to affordable housing, the company's vision and execution. She rewrote it entirely, centering Marcus's expertise as the actual reason for success. The celebration happened on a Friday afternoon with local officials and community members touring completed units. Victoria waited until most speeches had finished before taking the microphone, her prepared remarks feeling inadequate but necessary. This project succeeds because of Marcus Hayes' expertise. He taught us that value isn't about spending less, it's about spending wisely. These 40 families have quality housing because Marcus understood what they needed and how to deliver it within economic constraints that work. The credit belongs to him. Marcus stood in the back of the crowd, his expression unreadable but his attention focused entirely on her words. After the speeches concluded and crowd dispersed to tour units, he approached her with the careful neutrality of someone preparing for awkward professional interaction. That was generous. The recognition. It was honest. You made this happen. We made it happen. I consulted, you listened and implemented. The acknowledgement of partnership felt significant, a crack in the wall Marcus had built over the past weeks. Victoria recognized the opening and chose her next words carefully. I should have listened from the beginning, not just professionally, personally. I'm not asking for forgiveness or second chance, just want you to know you changed me. I see money differently, see people differently, see myself differently. Thank you for that. Even if you hate me. Marcus's response came slowly, as if he was testing how much truth to share. I don't hate you, Victoria. I'm angry and hurt and cautious as hell, but I don't hate you. He paused, something shifting in his expression. Rosie asks about you. Wants to know why you stopped coming around. I tell her adults are complicated, that people need space sometimes. She says if you care about someone, you don't leave. 8-year-old wisdom. Victoria felt hope surface for the first time in weeks. She's right. I shouldn't have left. I should have fought for you. You couldn't fight for me. You had to earn me. That's the difference. The distinction landed with clarity. Fighting implied forcing, earning implied proving worth over time through choices and actions rather than words or gestures. Victoria nodded, understanding, even as she recognized the long path ahead. Have I earned you? I don't know yet, but you're closer than you were. Monday afternoon, Victoria's phone rang with Marcus's number, the first time he'd called rather than texted in weeks. His voice carried tension that immediately put her on alert. I need help. Rosie's catheterization is tomorrow. $11,000 out of pocket after insurance. Hospital won't proceed without payment guarantee. I've delayed it twice already. Doctor says we can't wait longer. Victoria's response was immediate and absolute. I'll pay it. I can't let you. Stop. This isn't charity. This is Rosie's health. You can pay me back over time, interest-free payment plan, whatever terms work, but she needs this procedure tomorrow. Silence stretched long enough that Victoria heard Marcus breathing, heard him struggling with pride that had protected him through years of poverty. but might now prevent his daughter from receiving necessary care. I'm asking you, as a friend, not because you owe me, because Rosie needs help and I'm out of options. I'll sign a promissory note whatever you need, but please. His voice broke on the last word, the only crack in composure Victoria had heard from him since the hospital 2 months ago. Done. I'll call the hospital right now. It's handled. Thank you. Would you come tomorrow to the hospital? Rosie asked for you, and I want you there too. Victoria's throat tightened around words she couldn't quite form. I'll be there. Tuesday morning, Boston Children's Hospital pre-op area smelled of antiseptic and anxiety. The particular atmosphere of a place where parents brought their most precious things and trusted strangers with knives to make them better. Rosie sat in a hospital gown with monitors attached. Her red hair pulled back in braids that made her look simultaneously younger and older than 8. Marcus held her hand with the fierce gentleness of someone who'd survived this fear before but never became accustomed to it. Victoria arrived with coffee for Marcus and a small, stuffed purple elephant for Rosie, having remembered the bodega window from months ago. The girl's face lit up with joy that made the $12 purchase feel like the best money Victoria had ever spent. She's perfect. I'm naming her Victoria Jr., Vicky for short. Marcus almost smiled despite the circumstances, and Victoria felt warmth spread through her chest at the simple domesticity of the moment. Dr. Whitaker entered with consent forms and explanations delivered in the calm cadence of someone who'd learned to make terrifying procedures sound routine. Cardiac catheter through the femoral artery, 2 to 3 hours. Assess the VSD closure progress. Adjust treatment plan accordingly. Low risk but not zero risk anesthesia, always carrying potential complications that required monitoring. Marcus gripped Rosie's hand tighter, his knuckles white with the effort of appearing calm for her benefit. Victoria stood beside him, not touching but close enough to offer presence as support. Nurses arrived to take Rosie to the procedure room, and the girl's earlier bravery faltered as reality approached. Daddy, what if I don't wake up? What if I'm like Mommy? Marcus knelt beside the gurney, his hands framing Rosie's small face with tenderness that made Victoria's eyes burn. Listen to me. You're not like Mommy. You're stronger, braver. You're my girl, and you're going to be fine. I'll be right here when you wake up, I promise. And Miss Victoria? Victoria moved closer, placing her hand over Rosie's. I'll be here too, sweetheart. Promise. The nurses wheeled Rosie away, her small hand, waving until the doors closed and cut off visual contact. Marcus stood frozen in the spot where he'd last seen his daughter, his entire body rigid with suppressed fear. The waiting room offered uncomfortable chairs and outdated magazines, distractions that couldn't possibly distract from the knowledge that someone you loved was under anesthesia with surgical instruments near their heart. 2 hours passed with Marcus pacing and Victoria sitting quietly, offering presents rather than platitudes. Coffee appeared from somewhere. Victoria fetched it, and Marcus accepted without drinking, his hands needing something to grip. At the 3-hour mark, when procedure should have been finishing, Marcus stopped pacing and sat with his head in his hands. I can't lose her. She's everything I have left, everything that matters. Victoria moved to sit beside him, not touching, but close enough that her proximity offered comfort if he chose to accept it. You won't lose her. She's strong, like her father. Marcus lifted his head, and Victoria saw past his careful control to the terror underneath the constant fear of every parent with a medically fragile child, the knowledge that despite best efforts and deepest love, some outcomes remained beyond their power to control. Kate died on a table like this. 1 minute she was there, next minute gone. Every time Rosie has a procedure, I think this is it. This is when I lose her too. His voice broke, and tears he'd been suppressing for hours finally escaped. Victoria did something she'd never done before. She pulled him into an embrace, letting him lean into her shoulder while fear he'd been carrying alone found release. Marcus didn't push her away, didn't retreat into pride, just accepted comfort like someone drowning accepts a rope. Dr. Whitaker emerged 20 minutes later, still in surgical scrubs, his expression carrying good news before he spoke words to confirm it. Procedure went well. Better than expected, actually. The VSD has closed significantly on its own. She'll still need monitoring, but this is very positive progress. She's in recovery now, waking up well. Relief hit Marcus like a physical force, his entire body sagging as tension released in waves. Victoria held him steady, her own eyes wet with vicarious emotion for this family that had come to matter more than professional obligation could explain. Rosie's recovery room allowed 2 visitors, and she smiled groggily when they entered, still fuzzy from anesthesia but conscious and responding appropriately to questions. She reached for Marcus first, then extended her other hand toward Victoria, pulling them both close in a child's instinctive need for connection with the people who represented safety. "You both stayed, just like you promised." "Course we did." Rosie drifted back toward sleep, the anesthesia and procedure exhaustion overwhelming her effort to stay conscious. Marcus stayed at her bedside, but after an hour, when visiting hours ended and Rosie was sleeping peacefully, he followed Victoria to the cafeteria where they'd talked months ago during a different crisis. The cafeteria had the abandoned feeling of hospital spaces late at night. Most tables empty except for exhausted medical staff, grabbing quick sustenance between shifts. Marcus and Victoria sat near the windows overlooking the city, neither speaking immediately, both processing the day's accumulated fear and relief. "About the payment. I meant what I said. I'll pay you back, every dollar. We can set up a payment plan, or, Marcus, I don't want this to be transactional anymore. Not the job, not the payment, not us." The word hung between them, undefined but weighted with implication neither had voiced directly until now. Marcus looked at her with the assessing gaze she'd come to recognize, trying to determine if this was genuine or another variation of games people with power played with people without it. "I've been angry at you for so long, easier than admitting I have feelings for you. Because you have power over me, money, resources, options I don't have. If this goes wrong, I can't just walk away. You're my employer. Rosie's gotten attached. The power balance is too uneven." Victoria pulled an envelope from her purse, papers she'd spent the past week having lawyers draft and revise until they represented exactly what she intended. "Then let's even it out. The consulting contract ended with Roxbury completion. This is a new contract. Partnership. Equal equity stake in the affordable housing division. Bradford Properties splits into 2 branches. I run luxury development, you run affordable. Equal partners, not consultant, not employee. Partners." Marcus took the papers with hands that trembled slightly, reading terms that should have been too good to be true. 50% equity in a new division, equal decision-making authority, salary commensurate with partnership rather than employment benefits. That included comprehensive health coverage for his entire family. "You're offering me partnership in your family's company. Our father built this company on commercial real estate, but he never approached residential housing correctly. You showed me how. Roxbury proved affordable housing can be profitable and meaningful simultaneously. I want to do more projects like that with you, as equals." She leaned forward, needing him to understand the distinction she was making. "Not because I feel guilty, though I do. Not to assuage discomfort, though that exists. Because you're the best person for this work, and because I want you in my life. Professionally and personally. If you want that too." Marcus set down the papers, his expression showing the internal calculation of someone who'd learned caution through repeated betrayal of trust. "If I say yes to partnership, what about us? The personal part. That's separate. Business is business, has to be sustainable regardless of personal relationship. Us, that's something we build alongside business, not dependent on it. If you want to try." "I want to, but I'm scared. I've never felt this way about anyone since Kate, and I don't know if I can survive losing someone again." Victoria reached across the table and took his hand, the contact deliberate and meaningful in ways their previous touches hadn't been. "I'm going to trust you. against my better judgment and every instinct that says this is too risky. But if you hurt Rosie, I won't. I promise I love her. The admission came without planning words Victoria hadn't consciously decided to say, but recognized as true the moment they emerged. Marcus's eyes widened slightly, processing the declaration and what it meant for the careful boundaries they'd been maintaining. And me. And you. Marcus leaned across the table and kissed her, the contact tentative at first, then deepening as caution gave way to need held in check too long. Victoria kissed him back, tasting coffee and relief and the beginning of something that felt different than anything she'd experienced before. Genuine, earned, built on mutual respect rather than power dynamics or social performance. They broke apart when a nurse passed by with a pointed cough, both of them slightly breathless and significantly less careful about hiding emotion. Marcus kept her hand in his thumb, tracing small circles against her palm. This is complicated and probably a terrible idea given everything that's happened between us. Probably. But I'm willing to try if you are. Take it slow, figure it out as we go. For Rosie's sake as much as ours. For Rosie's sake and ours. They returned to Rosie's room where she slept peacefully, monitors beeping steady reassurance. Marcus settled into the parent chair while Victoria took the visitor seat, both of them keeping vigil through the night hours when children are most vulnerable and parents most helpless. Somewhere around 3 in the morning, with Rosie sleeping soundly and the hospital quiet except for distant machines and occasional overhead pages, Marcus spoke into the darkness. I proved my point better than you proved yours. You said that to me months ago and you were right. But you proved something too eventually. That you could change, that you could learn. That who you were at the gala wasn't who you'd always be. Victoria considered the long path from that October night to this November morning, measuring distance in lessons learned rather than days passed. You taught me what money is actually for. Not accumulation or display, but building things that matter. Taking care of people you love. Creating opportunities for families who need them. I'm still learning, but I'm trying. I know you are. That's why I'm here. Why I'm willing to risk this. 6 months later, spring arrived with Bradford Affordable Housing Division breaking ground on its second project, an 80-unit development that would house twice as many families as Roxbury. Press attended the groundbreaking, photographing Victoria and Marcus as they turned symbolic shovels of earth, alongside local officials who praised their innovative approach to making housing accessible to working families. The partnership was thriving in ways that surprised even Victoria's father, who'd been skeptical initially but now praised Marcus's business acumen as enthusiastically as his construction expertise. 3 more projects were in development stages, each one applying lessons learned from Roxbury to create housing that respected both human dignity and economic reality. Personally, Marcus and Victoria had been dating for 4 months, taking it slowly as promised. Family dinners at Marcus's apartment became weekly ritual, with Victoria learning to cook meals that didn't come from restaurants or delivery services. Marcus occasionally stayed at Victoria's apartment when Rosie was with Mrs. Sullivan, the two of them navigating intimacy with the caution of people who'd learned that trust rebuilt slowly and required constant tending. Rosie had adjusted to Victoria's presence with the adaptability of children who want their parents to be happy. Her initial wariness transforming into genuine affection. She called Victoria by first name now, no longer Miss Bradford, a small shift that somehow felt monumental in its implications. Her heart condition remained stable on adjusted medications, the VSD continuing to close on its own in ways that suggested she might not need additional surgery for years, possibly ever. After the press left the groundbreaking, Victoria and Marcus walked through what would eventually become a community courtyard, imagining playground equipment and garden plots that would transform dirt into gathering space. Rosie appeared with Mrs. Sullivan, who'd brought her to see Daddy's new project, and the girl ran to them with a drawing she'd made, 3 figures holding hands labeled Daddy, Victoria, and Rosie. Above them she'd written in careful printing, "My family." Marcus looked at the drawing, then at Victoria, a question visible in his expression that didn't require words. Victoria knelt to Rosie's level, accepting the drawing with reverence it deserved. "Is that what you want, for us to be family?" Rosie nodded enthusiastically, oblivious to the complexity her simple desire represented. Victoria glanced at Marcus, saw permission and hope and fear all mixed together in his face. "Then that's what we'll work toward, together, okay?" Marcus pulled both of them into an embrace that felt like promise rather than conclusion, the beginning of something they'd build deliberately rather than stumble into through circumstances. Around them, the construction site hummed with activity workers preparing to transform empty land into homes for families who needed exactly what Marcus and Victoria had learned: to create spaces that recognized human value regardless of economic status, structures that housed dreams rather than just bodies. Victoria thought about the night she'd handed her credit card to a stranger as a cruel joke, measuring the distance between that person and who she'd become. The journey hadn't been comfortable or quick, but standing here with Marcus's arm around her shoulders and Rosie's drawing clutched in her hands, she understood that some lessons could only be learned through breaking yourself against the reality of your own ignorance and choosing to rebuild differently. Marcus had proved his point better than she'd proved hers that night. But in the months since, she'd proved something too: that privilege could be unlearned, that power could be shared, that people could change if they cared enough to do the work required. Money wasn't the measure of a person's worth. How someone spent mattered more than how much they had. And the things worth building, partnerships, families, communities, required foundations stronger than wealth, more lasting than privilege earned through character rather than inheritance.